Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Stedman podcast. I hope you guys are having a great rest of your week as you are listening to this drop on Friday. Today, I have Micah Current back with me. He seems to be becoming more of a regular. Maybe like 10 more, or maybe one more, and then you could be an official co-host. How's that, Micah?
10 or 1. Let's meet in the middle, maybe 5.
All right, 5. Okay, we'll make it happen. We'll also count the two-parters as 2. All right, we'll make it a little bit faster.
I think that's up 4. This is like episode 4 for me, so I got one more to meet, like the official co-host status.
All right, cool. So today is kind of an interesting topic. It's actually been a topic I had a conversation with another pastor buddy of mine just probably a few days back. And it made me really think about the question of calling. So when we think about the word calling, Micah, how would you describe to someone what a calling is?
For ministry specifically, is that what you're asking?
Anything, if it's a calling for ministry, even if you feel like you're called to do whatever, even if it's outside of ministry related things.
Outside of ministry, I think it's more of like, how do you feel about an opportunity, whether that's a job, whether that's like a family situation or relationship with your friends. If you feel called to something, it's just having that, like that reassurance that you're doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. And respect to ministry, it's kind of the same thing, but like you feel that God is calling you to do that. He's calling you into a relationship with him and the ministry that you plan on serving or are serving at that moment. So I don't know. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I think about my calling in the ministry, to me, it was kind of a passion almost. And actually, I think kind of where you're going, like, outside of the ministry context, where it's something that you feel like a passion to, you maybe feel a drawing, whether it's a job opportunity that you think, wow, this is really going to really not only change your life, but in a way, it's just going to kind of set the trajectory that you're on of what you want to do, or, the things that you want to do within your family. There's like a certain type of calling that you have. In ministry, I think that there's always like a divine interference in some ways, and not interference in a bad way, but there's this idea of, I'm joined the ministry because I felt God had done something in my life, has spoken to me, has touched my heart, has kind of motivated and even kind of moved me in this direction to do ministry by kind of showing my gifts and talents, and even just kind of pushing me in that direction of just, my heart for people and my heart for reaching communities for Jesus Christ, and even just kind of creating a culture, a more of a kingdom driven culture with inside churches. That's kind of been a big calling for me. So for that, I think in some ways it's kind of like spiritually appointed when it comes to a calling.
Well, and it's also hard too, like, because you and I are kind of like, we've been talking about this over the last couple of months as like friends, as colleagues in ministry, as just people who have been on different podcasts and things like that. But like we're both kind of in the transition mm-hmm. in ministry seasons, and like it's hard. I think there's a huge problem. I don't know if you want to call it a problem, but like, Scott, you feel called by God. You feel called by God to lead churches. You feel mm-hmm. You feel called by God to do ministry, and but at the same time, you go and interview for positions in churches. You feel like God's calling you to that ministry, and sometimes those doors just shut. They're mm-hmm. emphatically shut in your face. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that like it's hard to feel called to do something and then like feel like you're not catching a break. Does that make sense?
Yeah, oh, yeah. And I think I definitely, that does make sense. I think kind of the difference between somebody who's just passionate about ministry and someone who has a calling for ministry is that, when those doors continue to shut, and it's been like, I don't know, for some, it could be years before they finally get something from their last ministry to this ministry. it's very easy to say, do I even want to do this anymore? Do I want to just kind of throw in the towel and say, you know what, I'm going to work at Amazon, get paid like $18 an hour or whatever they're paying, and just do that for the rest of my life, provide for my family, build up a savings account, put something in a 401k, because I mean, not too many people in ministry can have enough money to put in a 401k or a pension or anything, because frankly, every dime that they get goes to feeding their families and, paying bills and everything else. So when I think about the calling, not only is it divinely directed, but I also think that when it comes to, like you said, like when it comes to whether a minister is joining a ministry or leaving the ministry, there does seem to be a sense of calling of saying, okay, this is my time to go, or, I feel God's leading me to this ministry, so I'm going to put my resume, my cover letter, send some sermons over there. And hopefully, if I truly believe God's calling me here, then it's going to happen, or something's going to happen pretty soon. And that might be the next step. However, on the flip side of that, are we approaching a type of ministry culture right now where the sense of calling, or that idea of calling, is becoming less and less common, and is kind of becoming more of a business model on how you're going to get a ministry position?
I think it depends on the church. It depends on the location. It depends on the size. It depends on the DNA and what that church is about and what that ministry is about. I know in the area that we live in, we live in Southwest Ohio, close to Cincinnati, and there are several churches that are 1,000, 2,000, even all the way up to Crossroads, that they're one of the larger churches in the United States, and they have pastors who are like on a rotation for teaching on Sundays, but the rest of their staff are staff positions instead of pastors. But then there are mid-sized churches, I don't know, Scott, you've defined this before. What would you say, like anywhere from 2 to 500 to something like that?
Yeah, mid-size, I say probably maybe like 150 to like maybe 300, I would say is mid-size. Maybe up to 4.
I was thinking more like anywhere from 4 to 500 to 1,000 mid. Small to mid to me would be probably 150 to 500.
Oh, see, I would not. And then I guess if we're using those numbers, then there's very small, which is less than 100.
No. Like everybody, we've talked about it before, is like every church is different and everybody feels differently about different size churches and things like that. For me, what matters is the health of the church and the ministry at that church. So it could be a church of 100, but they're like healthy as can be, and they're really impactful in the community, and they have good staff, and they have a good pastor, and everything's great. Back to the position thing, the smaller to mid-sized churches usually, in my own experience, have most of the staff members, I would say, aside from maybe your office assistant or your administrative assistant, your office managers, things like that, your financial managers, they have those titles. But for the most part, everybody else has the title of pastor, whether it's children's pastor, youth pastor, worship pastor, media pastor, lead pastor, associate pastor, executive pastor, whatever, right? So like, for me, that is kind of my understanding of it. And I think we're kind of getting into like a rabbit hole. but like, honestly, Scott, like I think that the title pastor isn't what it used to be.
Yeah.
I mean, we just, if you look at larger churches in the area, they have the titles for job positions: director of video, director of first impressions coordinator, social media manager, coordinator of marketing. They don't have the title of pastor anymore. And a lot of those people don't really feel that sense of calling on their life. They just want a position, and they feel that they can get that position within a church and make a full-time salary. And a lot of larger churches are paying into what you're talking about with retirement having benefits, paying really well, but they're larger churches, and that's, it's just what they are, and that's their DNA.
Yeah, and I think when you go just kind of focusing on the calling aspect, you feel called to apply to a church. You apply to a church, you have your interviews, you have your candidating weekend, and then the congregation votes. And if you get the votes, then you are then called. And that's the type of language, the church has now called you to be, for you to be their pastor. And then do you feel the call to be these people's pastor? And if you say yes, then this whole idea of now I'm the pastor of this church, it is something that has been called upon by God. It's been ordained by God. So then there's this sense of spiritual belongingness. It's almost like this idea that now this heart, this new heart has been transplanted into this body, and now you are one body. But then you look at the other side where now you have things like coordinators and leaders. And then sometimes you have executive pastors and teaching pastors. And technically the teaching pastor is actually the one that's up on stage preaching the sermon. And the executive's the one who's kind of oversees more of the staff and operations and the budget and everything. And you're just like, well, doesn't executive sound like a more higher title than teaching? So we try to get into these business models, and I would think that the idea that are people even looking for a pastor anymore, or are people looking for somebody who knows how to run a bigger size church because they have experience, not necessarily as a pastor, but sometimes they could just be a Christian, a very well-rounded, well-founded Christian, but yet they do have experience of how to run a company. And you now kind of insert them into this spiritual model because they're the executive pastor, and they may not be the one preaching up on stage, but they are the ones who are kind of overseeing the ins and outs of the operations of the church.
Yeah. It's so good. One of the last churches that I worked at, it was kind of set up that way. So we, had the lead pastor who taught on Sundays. And of course there was a rotation of people who would teach, but the lead pastor would teach. But yet he was also part of a missions company in Florida. So he would teach a lot of times on Sundays, and then he would get on a plane and he would go to Florida, and he'd have meetings like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or be gone Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, come back on Wednesday, and we'd have our staff meetings on Wednesday, and he would be there for that. But there was very minimal contact with him, if that makes sense. He was a part of meetings. He was part of casting, vision, and he was part of sermon series planning meetings and things like that. And then during COVID, when we were pre-recording our live stream, I had a lot of contact with him because I was the video guy. And so we would just be producing, pre-recording his messages. And, but even then he came in, he preached, he was like, "Are we good?" I said, "We're great." And he left, right? It wasn't very personable. And it was hard. It was hard for me. So, because in other churches and ministries that I've worked for, I've always been very close to my, staff, whoever I've worked with, whether it was the lead pastor, other pastors on staff, and their families. We were all just really close. So this was the first experience for me where kind of had that, larger church mentality with very minimal contact to the lead pastor. And so I just kind of didn't feel like I was a part of that. And so, and Scott, and this conversation can go all over the place because you talked about that before we started recording. But I just felt like I wasn't a part. And so you can feel, very isolated. And when you start to feel that way, you just kind of shut everything off and just go through the motions. And then, we talked in a previous episode on your show about, just feeling, the sense of urgency to get a job in ministry. And you and I just talked about it before we started recording this episode, but we're not in a hurry to get our next assignment.
Mm-hmm.
And not like we're dragging our feet by any means, but we're like being, like you said, Scott, being very meticulous in respect to like, okay, is this going to be a good fit? Is this going to be good for my spouse and myself? Is it going to be a good fit for our kids? Is it going to be a good fit for, if we have to move and it's a big move, is it going to be something that's going to be sustainable for me and my family? Or are we going to get there for a year or two and then we're going to have to turn around and come back home because we just didn't feel like it was the right decision? And is God in it? Is God not in it? Do we still feel called? Do we feel that calling in our life? You just have to weigh out all those questions and weigh out all those options. And if it's not, yes, I'm actively searching for ministry positions at the moment, but like, unless I feel like an emphatic yes from the Lord, I'm not moving.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. And that's very good stuff because, like you said, like, I'm not in a hurry to go find my next thing. Cause there are certain things that, and I mean, I've always told the story about how, and I don't think I've ever told you the story, Micah, but there was a time where when I was looking for my first pastoral job, me and my wife, Laura, were just talking about whatever. And we were living in London, Ohio at the time, because she was going to Dayton to get her law degree. And I was, working at the camp at Ohio Ministries. And, she said, it would be nice if we found a place where you could walk to work and we can also walk to the library, because going to the library was very common for us. We'd go every week. And sure enough, my first pastoral position in Cortland, Ohio, I could walk. The church was right next door to the parsonage, just literally 30 seconds to get into the front door. And then just right around the corner was a library, a public library that we could walk to. And it's just like, wow, what an amazing coincidence this was. So, we do have certain things that we want in ministry, and we don't want to say, well, hey, here's a job, let's just go for it and see what happens. We have to say, we don't want to take my family and try to lay roots and try to hopefully see if we can get our kids all the way through elementary, junior high, and high school at the same place. And
I think it's, yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say that, like, I think it's one thing, like, how old were you when you got married?
20 late. I was probably 26 when I got married.
So we got married at 28.
Oh, so you beat me.
Yeah. But what I was going to say though, like, I think there's something to be said, like when you're younger and you're in your 20s and you're willing to move and do all those things. Now that I'm older, not so much, right? Like, I don't have kids yet. I know that you have kids, but that's a whole nother factor.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have to, as scripture says, be on guard and just really, weigh out those options and really, like, there was a couple of times when we moved, I was a kid, a pastor's kid, and we moved a lot. It was probably 6-7 years into each assignment where my dad got called to another place. So I was offered another ministry position. And so, like, feels like when we were finally getting there and we're established roots and we get friends, like, we were devastated as kids. We were just devastated because we had to move, but like, we knew that it was the right thing and it was the right time and the season. My dad went through a building program, and if you know, Scott, like, building programs can be the death of pastors, like physically be the death of pastors because of how much stress that goes along with building a new building, whether it's a completely new building, an addition onto the current building, a new sanctuary, a new fellowship hall, whatever you want to call it, new recreational center. It can just be a lot because you're taking out a lot of money, you're investing money, you're raising money. And my dad was, he was the lead pastor at a church. They wanted a new sanctuary. They wanted a new addition onto the current building. They did that. And as soon as the building was done and they were in it and they had the ribbon cutting ceremony, the church was like just done with my dad. They were done with him being pastor there because they got like what they wanted out of him.
Yeah.
And whether that's right or wrong, it was just, my dad just knew that door was shut and then it was time to move on. Wow. And so it was such a weird happenstance because I've never heard of anything like that before, but like, it was almost like, yes, we're so glad you're our pastor, but yet we got what we needed. And now it's time to turn the page.
Yeah. And again, going back to that idea of calling, you're called by somewhere, and then all of a sudden the people are like, nope. And they want to give you the boot. And it's like, well, if it's kind of that idea of, well, if God called me to this place and all of a sudden I'm here for 10 years or less. And all of a sudden the people are just like, yo, we're done with you now because we got everything we needed from you, or everything we wanted you to do, you did or didn't do. So we're just going to give you the boot, which I think, that's kind of traumatic in some ways. I think in the other ways, if you go to a bigger church and let's say you get hired and it's like, okay, we hired you, we like you, you go. And then all of a sudden it's like, if you're not performing a certain amount of numbers or producing numbers, it's like, okay, well,
they want to point the finger.
Well, how come you didn't baptize, if I'm the children's pastor, how come you didn't baptize 50 kids this year? We always do 50 plus kids every year. And then this year we only did 20. How come you didn't? And it's like, kids got baptized. Mm-hmm. Kids gave their life to the Lord and they are making a commitment to follow Jesus and they want to get baptized. What does it matter if it's not 50 or 20? 20 kids did. And I was talking to a pastor's buddy because we're talking about ministry and how sometimes when you're candidating or even if you're interviewing, they're just like, okay, what was the size of the church you previously were at? And sometimes they'll even ask you what, not only was the size, but what was the size of the church when you were there, and what was the size of the church when you left? Because they want to measure, if you grew by 20, 50, 70 people, then, hey, that's a good sign. We want you. If you get there and you lose 20 people, then it's like, well, we don't want you. And yet, and I was going to say, but the thing but yet, even though they're numeric numbers, you don't even understand like the culture of the situation, because a pastor could come into a place and literally walk into a hot steaming pile of poop and then have to deal with a lot of stuff. And you see a lot of stuff he had to clean out, which means sometimes people leaving the church and for it to get healthy sometimes in some ways. And all of a sudden it's just like, well, that's now your experience. And now that defines you who as a pastor, because you had to go do a big culture change in the church. And that means that some people had to leave the church in order for you to create a good, healthy ground in there.
Well, and not to throw COVID in there to get those metrics or whatnot, but how can people gauge that stuff now in 2022 with the standard of COVID? And we've talked about that in previous conversations of how people left church. They're not coming back to church. It gave people an excuse to leave church and not come back to church. People were legitimately scared to come to church. People don't feel safe, for one reason or another. And, you're talking about those questions, Scott, that they're asking when you're interviewing for a position. How can they gauge that in 2022 with those kind of parameters, especially with COVID?
Well, even with that, you can say okay, you can even show numbers. Yeah. Before COVID, we had, 70 people. And then when COVID hit, we now had about 25 or 30, but yet before COVID, we were only getting maybe 10 or 12 views of our sermons that we were streaming on Facebook. And now we're having close to 89, 100. And then not only on Facebook, but then you're also having another 20 or 30 on YouTube. Yeah. And it's well, those numbers are probably significant, but because everybody had to move into a streaming digital world real quick, especially if you're a church that wasn't set up for it, that those numbers, people don't know how to gauge those numbers. And then of course the question is well, is that someone who watches the whole entire sermon, or they just click the link to watch it for a second and then they backed out? I'm well, there's, depending on the website, there's a bunch of different metrics where you can find out if they watched it for 15 seconds, if they watch it for 60 seconds, if they watch it for a minute plus, you can gauge that stuff if you really want to. And I think when we get to those type of business model questions, or sometimes I was asked one question, do you see yourself as a conservative or a progressive? And it was one of those questions of why does that even matter when it comes to the church, especially if I'm proclaiming the gospel? Because the gospel should be neutral. It has no political party.
The gospel trumps political affiliation.
Exactly. So why am I being asked this question? And then, so it's very, so even so again, it's well, and I go back to the prophets, because I think about the prophets and who God called to proclaim you know, proclaimed to Israel during some of their times. And it's like you look at these prophets, and yeah, you have Isaiah, but you have Jeremiah, who basically was a kid. You have Ezekiel, who's tying himself down to the ground and like cooking his food over cow dung. And yet this is the one that God called to serve these people. And you're thinking to yourself, how do you judge who God is calling to your church by asking them all these questions, especially these questions that have nothing to do with character, have nothing to do with spiritual formation, have nothing to do with their knowledge of the scriptures of the Bible. A lot of these, it seems like a lot of times, a lot of these questions are, do you have a family? Do you have this? Do you have that? And it's like, who do you vote? Who did you vote for in the next election? How many people did you baptize? And even I was talking to my pastor, my pastor buddy, you know, he lost some people because they're doing like a complete culture change at his church. And it says, you know, by those numbers, I probably wouldn't be able to get a ministry job now. At the same time, in the last 20 years, there have been no baptisms at this church. And just in the last 2 years, we had 5 baptisms. And I'm thinking that's a more interesting number, that in 20 years, there was no baptisms. And then in the last 2 years, there was 5. To me, that shows that there's slow growth happening, spiritual growth happening, even though the numerics, even though the algorithm or the numerics doesn't look that great.
Would you rather have growth, period, or no growth at all? Like, that's kind of the question that you're asking, I think.
Yeah.
And you know, whether it's slow or, you know, slow and long term, or, you know, to what you're saying, Scott, like, is there growth happening or is there not growth happening? And for them, like in this moment, like whether it was 5 baptisms or 0, 5 is better than 0.
Yeah. Well, but at the same time, they don't ask the questions about how many baptisms did you do. They're only asking, how many members do you have in your church? And here's the fascinating thing. And it's one of these things which it's one of the, it's like almost like running a marathon than a sprint. You know what I mean? Because sprints are questions like, how much growth did you have? But a marathon's like, okay, what have you done in your past ministries where that growth is continuing even after you have left? For me as a board member, I would probably ask that question, because even in my ministry, there's been times where I have seen growth outside of myself with me being gone. And like, I mean, just last year, I got a text message from the treasurer at the church I pastored at in Ohio. And he was asking if we were going to be up around Memorial Day visiting family, because there is a new couple in the church and they're part of a motorcycle gang. And they're having like this big, like motorcycle Memorial Day motorcycle thing in the parking lot where they're going to have cooked food and just kind of have like a little block party. And I wrote him back. I'm like, oh no, sorry. We're not going to be able to make it because we're getting ready to leave for our Disney trip that got canceled when the pandemic hit in 2020. And, you know, just casual conversation. And then he writes back and he basically just said, hey, I just want to let you know, I want to personally thank you for everything you've done for us as our pastor all those years, because we have been seeing a lot of growth and a lot of changes, and our financial situation has been under control. And a lot of that had to do with a lot of the hard work you had to do as our pastor during that time you were there, when we were kind of in a rut, and you kind of helped us, you know, put some sand, put some wood underneath the tires to be able to get us out of that rut. And it's like, well, thank you. I mean, I was almost in tears because I'm like, oh my gosh, like, thank you so much for that. But yeah, I just find it so fascinating that when it comes to the idea of calling, it almost seems like, going back to the question, does calling even matter? And I feel like in this modern church culture that we are in,
it doesn't.
I don't think it does. And especially, which is kind of the big topic we're going to talk about today, is that I have heard reports from people that there has been a lot of poaching going on, specifically pastoral poaching, where churches without a pastor may see a pastor at another church and go, you know, we think that this person's doing great work there. We would really like to have them be our pastor. So what they do is they will reach out to this pastor and say, hey, we know you're at a church. we know you're a pastor at this church, but would you like to come and switch teams? Would you like to come and join our culture, join our tribe, and be our pastor? And I find it fascinating that has become more prevalent, because I feel like more and more, not only am I hearing it, that has happened to pastors where they left positions because another church has contacted them and offered them the role, kind of bypassing the whole candidacy or sending in your applications or putting the job position out there. But at the same time, even the idea that when church, as search committees are trying to find pastors, sometimes they're getting advice that, hey, if you want to find a pastor that you want, you need to go out and recruit. And I have an issue with that.
I can tell. I can tell you're getting a little.
Well, and again, it goes back to the topic. Does calling matter?
Mm-hmm.
And if calling does matter, then why are churches or even church staff going out and poaching pastors from other churches that they're other shepherds who are shepherding other sheep?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to answer that because you're a little fired up, Scott.
Oh, I'm gonna simmer a little bit. I'm gonna turn the heat down a little bit.
All right, you take a drink of something, decaf. I know you've been up for a while, so probably switch to decaf at this point.
I will.
No. So one of two things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's just say two things. One, are you talking about specifically like lead pastors, or are you talking about associate staff, or like all of it?
I would say all of it. And again, from a lot of from my setting, there's very few churches that I know of, or pastors that I know of, that have multiple staff. Usually it's maybe just a pastor and a secretary, or it may be a pastor and associate, and that's it.
And like the associates by vocation are not even paid.
Yeah. Or if you do have a full-time associate, they're usually, they're just kind of either there for a couple of years, or in the case of like the church I grew up in, the associate pastor there has been there for over 25 years.
Okay. Yeah. So a couple things. One, I kind of went through a situation a couple of years back. I don't know if you want to call it poaching.
Okay.
I don't, there were some lay people within the church that I was at that weren't very happy when they found out what I did. But I was the associate, worshiping young adults pastor at a church. The lead pastor hired me and some other staff people, and we were there. I was at this church almost 2 years, and the person that hired after me was there for about a year. And then in November of that year, he told us that he was leaving. And so he went to another church. And so we went through the whole interim phase of like, what are we doing next? Who's going to be our next lead pastor? What are we going to do? And so like during that time, the board got together without my knowledge, came into my office on Good Friday. It wasn't really Good Friday in my book. And gave me a new contract for my job, and gave me all these new rules and guidelines of which they wanted me to follow, and basically made me sign a contract and said that after 60 days, if I wasn't like, I guess, shaping up to being the way they wanted me to be, I was out, basically going to lose my job. So I was young. I was engaged. I had just got engaged, and my wife, now my fiance then, was trying to find a job in Ohio to move here so that we could start our life together. And the same pastor who had left that same ministry took another church in North Carolina and called me and said, "Hey, I can hire you at this other at my new church. It's not full time. You may have to find another job." And this was all dependent on, Alicia, my wife, finding another job. And thankfully it worked out. God opened those doors, and we were able to move there for almost a year. But I don't know if you want to consider that poaching or not.
I would say no, because here's where
I was kind of pinned up against the wall.
Well, I'm not here to pin anybody up against the wall. I'm here to have the conversation. But no, I mean, yeah, but like in your case, you have an ultimatum. And I think it's different. And I think it's different if, let's say, for an example, you're a worship leader, and let's just say your things just aren't going well, or maybe you're kind of in that point of season where you're just debating, am I going to leave? Am I not going to leave? And you're kind of already in that thing of, man, I'm ready to leave, but I'm kind of nervous because I don't know what's next. So you're kind of in that like waiting season, but then next thing you know, someone may call you and say, hey, like I may call you and say, hey, I need a worship leader. Would you like to be our worship leader? And it's like, I'm already out the door. I had some leaders barge in my office saying, hey, here's our demands. You got to meet each of these demands. To me, I wouldn't say that's poaching, because it's automatic. Because even if you did meet those demands, more likely just knowing church culture and kind of knowing, and just reading case study after case study, more likely if you hit all those benchmarks, they're probably going to throw more benchmarks on you to get you to finally either burn out or finally just say, I can't take this anymore. And you're just going to walk out the doors anyway. I don't see that as poaching. Where I kind of see the line of poaching is the idea of, you're a pastor, you're at a church, you're comfortable, you like being there, you don't have anything in your mind that is telling you you should leave. Not an inkling, not a thought. And then all of a sudden you get a letter, you get a phone call, you get a text message basically saying, hey, we would like you to be our pastor. And just to kind of tell the story, I've been here in Stanton for 7 years. I was the pastor at the Stanton church here for 6 years. In the 6 years of ministry, I have gotten 2 letters in the mail from churches specifically asking me if I would want to jump ship. One particular letter back in 2016, I got a letter from a church, and it said, on the letter, it said, Pastor Scott Stedman, had the address. I'm like, cool. I open it up, and the first words that are on there is like, Dear Pastor Thompson, we would like you to be our pastor. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. my last name's not Thompson.
That's the wrong person.
So it's the wrong person, but the envelope was right. The letter was wrong. So I'm thinking, was there somebody in there basically going through like the Church of God directory and going, hey, this person's kind of within a close proximity that can move very quickly. Let's just send a bunch of letters out and see what happens. The other time would have been in 2018. I got a phone call. Someone asked me if I wanted to jump ship and go somewhere else. And I told them absolutely not. I said, and I was pretty blunt with them. I said, nope, I feel like God has called me to this place for a reason. I feel like that we are making great trajectories, doing great ministry. And I don't think that God is calling me to leave. And I was very polite about it, but there's a part of me that goes, but there's still that inkling of going, well, if you're just handpicking people, then what's the point of putting your information out there for people to apply? And again, what's the sense of calling? Does calling even matter anymore? And it seems like those, and I mean, and in those situations, I would have to say no, because right now it seemed like we need a pastor. We're in desperate need of one. So we're going to go and we're going to find a pastor. Doesn't matter if he's available or if he's pastoring another church. We are going to go find a pastor.
Well, and then you have all these churches who sit empty and are in desperate need of pastors, and they're being so picky about who they pick, right?
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of it has to do with their own DNA as a church and church health and well-being. There are just so many churches out there that need pastors that are sitting empty right now. And it's almost like we're playing mind games where you're cherry picking certain, pastors to do certain assignments. And it's just like, and we're not even talking about like, Church of God, I don't think, right? We're just talking about churches in general.
Just churches in general.
Like it's just fascinating. It's truly fascinating. And like, you go back to like talking about a process about picking a pastor, and, churches already have, I've seen with my own eyes, churches that like have lost senior pastors. They go through the process of hiring somebody else, and they already have the person in mind who they want to pick. They just go through the motions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And so like, it's just, why drag your feet on that, and why let that pulpit sit empty for so long when you already had the person in mind anyway?
Yeah. And it's very interesting, because when I think about that, I think about, if Israel could, it's the idea of Israel picking their own king. We want a king. God says, nope, we want a king. Okay, here's your king. And they're like, or here, God sends a prophet and he's telling them stuff. It's like, well, we don't like this prophet. We like this other prophet that's saying all the good things about us. So when you think about church culture and just the overall church, like, for you to say, well, we want this particular person to do these particular things, and that's who we're going to cherry pick. Are you really picking someone who is going to be used by God to transform the church into the direction that God wants? Or is it basically saying, this is the person we want so that they could be in here, they could teach us about God and kind of keep things the way that things are already going, and not make any too subtle changes that need to happen that the Lord is asking us to do? Because I could pick Billy Graham. I mean, I could pick Stephen Furtick to be my pastor.
Mm-hmm.
But is that going to be the right fit? And is that exactly who we need to bring the type of change that God wants for this church? Not necessarily what Stephen Furtick or a Billy Graham or a Scott Stedman or a Matt Chandler vision for the church.
It's I think it's a fine line. And, we're talking about, I've seen over the course of, 10 plus years of doing this, where people go into places and they find out that they're just really not that happy where they are. And so they want an out. And so they go to the next thing, and they keep kind of running in circles. And it's not that that's healthy or any kind of like way to live your life. But yeah, it's such a fine line. And it also has to, Scott, I think a lot of it has to do with the health of the church, the church that you're at. So like, if you're in a ministry situation and a season of ministry and things aren't going great, and, you get a letter in the mail or an email or a text message from a fellow pastor who's on staff at another church, and, says, hey, we got a position over here. Do you want to come? Are you interested? Yeah. Like, can you blame people? No, if the church isn't not healthy and the church isn't in a good space, and you don't feel like you're in the right space, like I shared my heart in another episode we did. Like I was making more money than I've ever made in my life in a ministry job, and I walked away because I felt like the Lord was releasing me, and it just wasn't a healthy space for me, and I wasn't thriving in that moment. And I felt like I was thriving more to get, like, especially during COVID, to go help churches that needed it, because there were so many churches. Didn't matter what kind of church they were churches nonetheless, and they were sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that was the most important thing to me.
Yeah. And I think you're right. There is a fine line, and it's not like, it's hard. You can't really, I feel like in ministry, you can't paint broad strokes. Just like when we talked about earlier, you can't just say, well, what were your numbers before and after, because you don't really see the culture. You don't really know the people who lives were completely changed, or the people who had like more of a stagnant faith, and through one's ministry their faith went from being stagnant to just constantly growing, and they're growing great fruit. But you can't gauge that on an Excel sheet.
Well, let's take it a step further, can we?
Yeah, go ahead.
So like we talk about church poaching, but like let's talk about pastors who stay too long.
Yeah.
Right. And how unhealthy that is, and how much more long-term damage it does to the church. And then when churches go to find another pastor, they have such a terrible time finding that person because the people were so invested in the other person, or that person stayed too long and the damage has been done and they can't kind of seem to recover from that. And it's almost like they're rebuilding the entire ministry. Like you go into an existing ministry as a new pastor and you try to build upon what's already there and cast your vision. But if all that is in shambles because the pastor before you, refused to leave when they should have, or, ran it in.
Yeah.
And to your listeners, that doesn't mean scandal. That means they should have left, and they should have feel that God was releasing them from that ministry, and then they didn't go.
That's
more what I was.
Yeah. And I think there is a difference, because I know one of my pastor buddies here, he's a pastor at one of the bigger churches here. And he's even kind of talked about, the idea of transitioning. He goes, I think I have 3 years left. I've been here for, 17, 20 years. I feel like I probably have 3 more years. So what can I do now to help make that transition smooth? So by the time I retire, resign, whatever the case may be, that when I leave, the church is already set up to a place that it can thrive without a lead pastor. But at the same time, kind of understand, okay, here's kind of our vision. Let's find a pastor that's going to help move in that direction, and don't feel like we have to rebuild everything again, because so much of our church's identity was based on one person. And
would you like to know why, though? Succession plans scare the crap out of churches.
Yes, they do. 100% agree with
you. I think that's the right answer to that question and that comment.
And even if I think and I can even think of, and this may be another topic, but even pastors who may have retired or maybe gone, but yet they still attend a church when the new pastor comes up. And it's almost like, it's one of the things where when that happens, you're kind of like, well, why would I want to be at a church where the former pastor attends there? Like, that doesn't sound good. And most cases, I find that there's very few, maybe less than 5%, where that has actually been beneficial.
That's one of the most unhealthy things you can do.
Oh, yeah. Well,
if you retire, resign, leave a ministry assignment, and you hang around, your lay people are just going to look to you for answers. They're going to look to you for vision. They're going to look at you because, even though you're not the pastor anymore, they're just going to they're used to that and they're accustomed to that. And it's not healthy, especially when you've tried to put somebody else in your role.
Yeah.
It's like you're just sitting there watching.
Well, I remember when I resigned from my church here in Stanton, I was asked by a couple people, after you resign, are you still going to attend here? Yeah. And I basically told them no. And it wasn't like, well, I don't want to be here anymore. It's like me being here after I resign is not going to be very fruitful for anybody, for me, for anybody. And whenever you get the new pastor, it's not going to be fruitful for them if I'm still sticking around.
It's like you're squandering their chances of being successful.
Yeah. It's like, and for me, my thing is if I did everything that I needed to do, or I feel the Lord has called me to do in that place for this many years, then it's time for someone else to go and take the plow and start working. I don't need to hold the same plow that he's going to be using to plow, or he or she going to be using to dig the fields. I don't need to hold the handle. If I say I'm done, I'm going to walk away. Will I come back and visit? Yeah, I'm sure eventually. But if I do, it's going to be a while. It took me at least over a year before I came and visited the church in Ohio. And I just came in and checked and it wasn't necessarily I was checking things out. It's like, I want to attend here. I just want to worship and just be just say hi to everybody that I knew. But when I was there, I wasn't there to go, okay, how's the new guy? I wasn't stirring crap up, which sometimes some pastors do that. If they like to stir stuff up, or they like to call people and go, hey, how's the new guy working out for you? And, and if anybody says well, we like the new pastor, but there are some things, what are those weaknesses? And then I'm going to exploit them. I mean, I just got off the phone with somebody who that's what the former pastor did, retired, stayed in the area, and basically will call other members of the church and talk bad about this other pastor. And I'm thinking, why? How is that fruitful to the kingdom of God when you do that?
Yeah. And I think too,
and again, was your ministry based on following God, being called by God and following God's will, or was it based on your own destiny to try to build a name for yourself or to build a platform for yourself?
Well, and too, like, I think that there's an attachment issue. Lay people get so attached to their pastors, and especially if pastors have been there a long time, let's just say 10 to 12 years, and then they take another ministry assignment somewhere else. Like, I've seen it with my own eyes where people will get attached to the pastor, and then the pastor says, hey, I'm retiring, I'm taking another ministry assignment somewhere else, I feel like God's releasing me from this assignment and we're going somewhere else. Nothing's wrong, there's been no affair, there's been no foul play, there's been no embezzlement or any kind of anything to hinder the ministry there. They're just legitimately feeling released. And then those lay people, it almost feels like they're more, what's the right phrasing for this, Scott? They're more like attached to the person than they are with their relationship with God. And so like when the pastor leaves, they're like, well, this person did it this way, this person did it this way. I'm like, well, yes, you can have a relationship and yes, you can be friends with them, but like the end result should be Jesus. And like, if you're more invested in the pastor than your relationship with Jesus, there's another problem. There's another heart issue there.
Exactly. And really, if we boil it down, it's an idolatry issue.
Yes. Like, it's almost like pastor is the middle person, right? You have your lay people, you have God, Jesus, all that stuff, right? And like the pastor is the shepherd, the leader, the vision caster, and kind of leads the flock and shows them what God is delivering them. It's kind of like that middle man, right? That middle person. And some people are more invested in the pastor than their relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess
I feel like we've went all over the place with this, but like, yes, pastor coaching is a real thing, and does calling matter? And I think it does, but like at the same time in 2022, wow, that's probably the first time I've done that.
I haven't done it on a check yet, but definitely do it on a podcast.
And we're into February, my friend. We're into February. So I made it a whole month.
There we go.
But like if you look at churches' websites in reference to jobs, I don't think you're gonna see the title pastor very much anymore. And this has been kind of a broad conversation, but like it's like if it's the lead pastor, like what is their title? Is it just pastor? Is it lead pastor? Is it teaching pastor? Like, does that matter? Does it have pastor in the title? Like, and is that more of a marketing thing, like to make people think that you're cooler or not? Like I'm looking at a job. I'm looking at a church right now in the area where I live, and it's a rather large church. And I'm looking at their jobs: administrative project manager, facilities team member, connections director, broadcast video technical director, front of house engineer, stage and lighting director, video technical director, worship leader, kids club level director, student ministry operations director, site director, project manager, videographer, initiative manager, executive assistant, operations manager. There were 20 jobs there, Scott, and not one of them say pastor.
Wow. And wow. And I think even with the word pastor, like you said, is it a marketing thing? Well, you could have a pastor, but do you really want a shepherd, or do you really want, a Fortune 500 leader? Do you really want a leader who knows how to do the analytics of trying to build growth or trying to build a brand or try to build marketing? Or do you need a pastor that's going to shepherd people, especially during times of crisis, during times when people are sick, during times people really need the Lord's healing touch in their lives? I think that's a very legitimate question. I think that's a question that not only us as pastors have to ask and account for, but I think for those of us who are just congregants, lay leaders, or maybe some of you who happen to stumble onto this podcast and you're just like, hey, I have, I am on a search team. And you're listening to this and it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't poach a pastor. Maybe we should reevaluate. Do we really care about the calling, or do we really care about finding someone that's going to kind of fit within our brand, that fits within our identity that we have created?
Well, and see, like, Scott, how old are you again?
I'm going to be turning 40 in March.
Right. So like, how much of it has to do with age as well? Like, are we too old to not be cool enough to be the lead pastor or the associate pastor or the worship leader? Or are we not old enough to be the lead pastor? Do we have enough experience? You and I've had that discussion on a separate.
Well, it reminds me of that movie, The Secret of My Success by Michael J. Fox. Like in the beginning, he's trying to find this job in the big city. And it was like, and he had this big rant where he's like, either I'm too young for the position or I'm too old. Either I don't have enough experience, or I have too much experience. Either I'm underqualified or I'm overqualified. And it's like in this busy business world, sometimes sometimes you could be the most skilled, the most talented, the most professional. You could be the best pastor that particular church needs, and yet you'll be overlooked because either you're underqualified, overqualified, and all these other businessy metrics that basically say, well, you're too old, so we're not going to, or you're too old and you're 40 and you're not married, so no, we don't want somebody. Or you have two younger kids, but we really need someone with older kids to kind of help round out our youth group and stuff. And it's like, okay, well then I guess that has nothing to do with calling anyway. It's just, again, fitting within your own brand.
Well, which is interesting, and this is not ministry related, Scott, but like for your listeners, my secular job, my full-time job right now is I work at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And if you look at their jobs, they have jobs where they're very super specific as to what kind of education and background they want. And then there are jobs where they want a high school diploma, like the equivalent of a high school diploma or more. And so like when I was looking for a full-time job again, like in order to get a job and get my foot in the door, I had to take stuff off my resume because I was overqualified. Right. Like I went to seminary, I went to undergrad, I got, ordained in the Church of God as a pastor. And I took a lot of that stuff off of my resume just so that I could get my foot in the door and get paid an hourly wage with a full-time job of benefits and health insurance. So it's just a crazy happenstance. And like, I feel like that's a big misconception, especially in ministry. If we could come back to that for a second, as far as, they want you to be this, this, and this. And then when you get there, it's nothing of what they talked about when you interviewed. And it's like, how can you expect the world from me if, you weren't super honest and upfront with like what you were expecting?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just this topic is great. I mean, it's just all over the place because to be honest, like they all go hand in hand. Like the whole poaching thing is basically another word for, yes, do you feel called somewhere? Do you feel like there is like a legitimate, calling on your life? And, Scott, I could answer that question. Like the last ministry assignment that I was at, I felt like I was called there, but I got there and it wasn't what I was expecting.
Yeah.
And I got there and I just felt like I was way out of my league, and I just didn't feel like I fit into their team. I didn't feel like I was a part of that ministry. I just went in there. I did what they needed me to do. It was almost like I clocked in and clocked out and I was done.
Wow.
And it was very hard because I had no relationships at all. And as soon as I felt like that, I just shut down. Right. And that's not a healthy place to be in either.
No. Yeah. But again, like you say, we're kind of all over the place, but I think a lot of these topics really go back to the foundation. They're tethered to the foundation of, does calling matter? And I think that's a question that we all have to ask, whether we're a pastor, whether we're a church leader, whether we're, looking for, if we're a church member who's on a team that's looking for worship pastor, children's pastor, lead pastor, senior pastor, whatever pastor, or if you don't even use pastor, if you use just leader or team member like Target does, then you have to like ask yourself, does the sense of calling matter? And if you can't blatantly say yes it does, then you may have to reevaluate your practices and your policies of how you do ministry, because if you believe calling is an important part of ministry and yet you don't take it serious, then what are you doing?
Yeah.
So, and guys, that's going to be it for us today. If you would like to keep this conversation, feel free to, make a comment. We'll definitely get back to you. I don't know if we'll ever jump on this topic again. I'm sure it'll be brought up again in another episode on something else we'll be talking about. We'll just seep back into here because it is so prevalent and so interesting now in our culture today. But again, Micah, thank you so much for joining me. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yep. And guys, again, thank you so much for listening. And again, if you like this podcast, feel free to give us a 5-star review. Feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to support this podcast financially, you can go to my coffee account. That is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. There's a lot of incentives there that you can do if you want to be a monthly donor, or if you just want to donate one time. We definitely appreciate it. All proceeds go to the better to help and do improvements on this podcast. So guys, again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back next week with a new episode. Talk to you later.